Okay, so go ahead. I think all the assignment B1s are graded. I think all the grades that were needed to be graded are graded. So all those are in for all the assignment B1s. I try to provide feedback on. I was really impressed with a lot of really great causal loop diagrams, like good system choices. So like, well, really well done. But you know, a couple of minor things like are variables measurable, sortable, those sorts of things. I tried to make some notes. If a causal link wasn't really like justified, I tried to make notes about that. So look out for those notes, take a look at that feedback, click on the view feedback link in that to see that. Otherwise, the scores are out there. If you have any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll get you the assessment for this assignment C for this unit very soon. Muddy's Point this weekend, and I've made the reading for next week available so as we move into complexity and the topic of chaos. So that will be next week. Today, you know, pivoting off that reading, I want to make sure that we cover bifurcation diagrams, tipping points, and of course, critical slowing down. So a lot of interesting comments in the perusal. Before we kind of get into that, any questions on any of that? Everything seemed good administratively. Otherwise, any reflections or questions about the reading? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, and I think that's probably I would assume how many other people thought abstracts were good, but then it got really yeah, and that's generally how these things work. It just takes a while. So you know, like in my job, you know, so 40% of my time is teaching, but another 40% is research. And so in my job as research, you end up learning to read articles like that, and you know, never read textbooks, but it takes a really long while to, you know, to build up all of that foundation, that content grammar, so that you can start reading those articles and feel comfortable about it. But most people just read abstracts and get the general gist and only drill down into the article if they need to know more details. And so so that's actually pretty common. So I wasn't expecting you to follow along with everything there, but the biggest thing is that I wanted to generally introduce this idea that these transitions exist, are theoretically predictable using frameworks that we talk about in this class, really motivated by frameworks we talk about in this class, and that people have actually gone out and done it. So people have gone out to lakes in the middle of Wisconsin and, you know, dumped fish into them for 3 years long, and we're still able to, by measuring these other variables, predict when these transitions are going to happen. Or you know, a lot of lake systems, lakes are kind of natural laboratories for these things, but you know, and they say, well, potentially maybe you could do this with social systems. So that was the key thing I wanted to take out of it, is the basic idea that these kind of ball-in-basin models suggest critical slowing down, and that in real systems, critical slowing down seems to actually be happening just before these tipping points. And we'll define what those terms mean. Any other reflections or comments or questions? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, so grading in the first part of the course is a little weird because, for one, yeah, Canvas is trying to do all the automatics, but like there's a drop 6 policy for the unit assignments, but we've only had you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't know, 4, something like that, and then I've got a couple that are hidden from you. They're like 5 or 6, so it's not really sure what to do when it doesn't have enough to drop, and it's, I think, a little non-deterministic what it decides to do. So so when you look at your category grades, that's when you kind of infer like what's going on here. And if you look at your like unit assessment category grade, it might say that it's now like 100% or something like that, or more, or whatever. So I would take a look. So this assignment B1, it was the only one of these that that had extra credit. And so that little bit of extra credit was enough to maybe move the category grade up significantly. And we have a bunch of categories like the midterm's not there, the final exam's not there, the creative project's not there. Those are a big chunk of your grade. So if you take those out because it's a weighted grade, these unit assignments are like almost all your grade. So if your unit assignments get a little extra credit, then it like might propel the rest of your grade up. And so you're going to get a lot more variability because Canvas is using a weighted system on all these categories, and a bunch of categories aren't there, and the drop policies are kind of generous, which I think that'll help in the end of the semester, but it's a little frustrating at the beginning of the semester when you're like, I'm not actually sure where I'm sitting. So what I have done is I monitor all your guys' grades, and if I notice red flags, I'll send you ASRs and emails, academic status reports and emails. If things look okay and I do a couple little calculations and I kind of look across your categories and see how well you're doing, then I don't kind of worry about it. And I think that I think almost everybody in this class right now, I think, is doing fine. The way I've engineered the drop policy, I've tried to make it so that if you put up an honest effort in the class, hopefully you'll be rewarded with a decent score at the end. And so there's opportunities. It's sort of bimodal. There's opportunities to not do well, but if you do well enough, then hopefully things like that drop policy and all that will just pull you up into that other group. And that's totally okay with me to have a group of people over here and a group that are in a small group over here. So yeah, I start with the variability on Canvas, but it's just, it's not so elegant. It's very non-linear as these assignments go trickling in. If I taught this course before and all these assignments were already there, it would make it a little bit better, but it's still the problem that like we don't have a midterm yet, that sort of thing. So that's the other thing, is once we go through the midterm in a couple of weeks, then it'll start stabilizing and buffering your grade, because the midterm is another big chunk for the categories. Any other questions? Okay, all right. So just as a review, because we didn't actually get these, all of these terms covered last time, but they were covered in the previous reading and they're relevant to this reading. So just as a review, do we remember, resilience? Does anybody still have a good definition of resilience? Yeah. Yeah, ability to bounce back. So elasticity, ability to bounce back. We could also say resistance to external changes, kind of resilience. Now, there's this other term that was introduced at the end of the last chapter, adaptability, which is a little bit different than saying a system is adaptive. They're related, but when we talk about a system's adaptability, did anyone catch what that was? That was, again, sort of at the end of the last chapter from the last reading. Yeah. Yeah, well, so there's two. So there's adaptive and there's adaptability. So and they're related. And so I would say, like, when the system itself can make its own changes to sort of support its function, we would say it's adaptive. But adaptability is, as humans on the outside, when we look at systems, we'd say, that lake pretty soon is going to go into a eutrophication event, and it's going to change the lake forever. And how adaptable the lake is how able is it for us to make our own changes as humans, to try to rescue the resilience. So adaptability is sort of how able a system is to be managed or changed to rescue resilience. So resilience is kind of like its natural ability to hang on. Adaptability is what ability does it have when it's about to fail, when it's about to go over a threshold, what can we do to change it? So like our own bodies, we need our hearts, right? But if in the very worst case scenario, when someone's heart fails, we do have, they're not going to last as long, but we do have mechanisms that are artificial hearts or artificial pieces of hearts that can be substitutes. So we can adapt someone to deal with that potential catastrophic event. So adaptability is how, when you couple the system with the humans, again, social ecological systems, that coupled system, how adaptive is that system? That's, I guess, another way to view it. So resilience is sort of the background for one system. Adaptability, once you couple it with the humans, that system itself is able to adapt. And eventually it can't. So then there's this other term that I may not have even mentioned the last time, but it was in the chapter, transformability. And there was a nice box in the last chapter where they gave kind of an example of this. Did anyone catch this term transformability? Yeah. Yeah, you're kind of giving up on the old way you use the system, and you find a new way to use the system that that somehow copes with the new reality, but still achieves some new function. So it's this sort of ability to transform a system to a new function, a new use, I'll say a new function. So it's sort of, the pessimistic side of things would say it's kind of like giving up, but it's, so I think they have an example where there was a wetland that someone drained and put cattle ranching there. Their cattle ranch was just not successful. So they end up filling it back up and then coming up with a different business case for how they're going to use that land, and were very successful for that. So that particular system was transformable because it had sort of a contingency plan, a plan B that you could adopt if it was just too hard to get your plan A to keep working. And so when we talk about resilience, then we hopefully have a system that provides a useful function that is naturally resilient. If it is not, we hopefully have the ability to go in and try to rescue some of that resilience as it gets close to these thresholds. And if that isn't going to work out, then hopefully the system is transformable into something else that can serve some other function, or can continue to be productive in a different way. So those are those kind of three terms. So any questions about these three terms? We'll see these terms throughout other parts of the semester as well. Kind of guiding principles in resilience thinking. Yeah. It absolutely can be. So the question was, if a system is highly resilient, might that mean it is not very adaptable? And I haven't actually applied a saying that like there can be systems that are in bad states but are very resilient. Like there can be a social norm that we would really like to maybe get rid of, but the system is so resilient that it's just hard to get rid of that social norm. And you might try to adapt and say, well, what if I give you an incentive to stop, like littering? Let's say littering is just socially accepted. And you can say, well, what if I fine you every time you litter? Well, certainly that disincentive will cause people to stop littering. But if it's highly resilient, that like that's just people's right to just litter, then no matter how much tax you put on it, then they're just going to keep littering. So it's not a very adaptable system. So yes, if resilience can be a challenge to adaptability, often when we use these terms, we're talking about using adapting systems to rescue their resilience. But yeah, I think you could also use the terms the other way around and say, we have a problem in a system. We would like to move the system to an alternative stable state where people don't litter. And that would require, that's really, technically a transformation because we're coming up with something new to that. But if a system's highly resilient, it might have low transformability. So maybe that's a good way to link those together, is that adaptability is often in the service of resilience. But if you've got a bad stable state that is resilient, then transformability is the ability to try to move it to an alternative stable state that's a good one. Hopefully is that a decent, okay answer? Okay. Any other questions with these three terms? Now I wanted to make sure we brought those up because adaptability kind of implies that something bad is going to happen. You have to kind of know when is it time to step in and take a. I mean, hopefully you're not in a situation where conditions are pushing your system to the point where something bad is going to happen. But we know that can happen. And so we need a sort of a way to detect that. And I like this three set of papers. And so I picked this first one by Schaefer. And I like also because this paper gets into talking about differences between complex systems and introduces the idea of modularity and heterogeneity, which we'll see again in some other resilient stuff that we'll see later in the semester. And so, and this has to do with how transformable and how adaptable these systems are. And so, does anyone remember what were so I guess I kind of sort of said that, like the two important features that Schaefer identifies for determining if complex systems are kind of wicked or if complex systems are a little bit more manageable are their so-called heterogeneity and connectivity. And so, so if I just maybe write this up here. So complex systems, we can think about how they differ in their heterogeneity and connectivity. And so we can have a system that is very, so on this side, we can have a modular system that is very heterogeneous. So modular and heterogeneous. And what we mean by that is that we've got a bunch of parts, like I'll say, A, B, and C linked together over here. And then another set of parts, and maybe some of them are similar parts, so they don't all have to be different. And they're kind of linked together. And another set of parts, and they're sort of linked together over here in their own way. And each one of these has weak connections between them, but there's much tighter connections inside here. And so we can kind of think of each one of these things as like, each one of these things is like a module. And each module itself, could itself be, a subset of other modules. So there could be a hierarchy here of this. And each module has maybe a different function and operates independent, or I don't want to say totally independent, but is less dependent on others in system. And so when we have a complex system that's like this, it's still complex in that we may not know exactly how some little subunit like this H down here contributes to the whole function. But when we kind of zoom out, we start seeing these components that make the system act more like a complicated system. And this, like I said, is like a multicellular organism. Our bodies are a complex system, but they've been organized into these hierarchical modules so that we can say, you know what, I have a heart and it has specific functions that I understand. I don't completely understand all of the weird things that could go on with my heart or my brain or whatever. Like somebody might have epilepsy, like my dog has epilepsy. And so occasionally, you know, hopefully not more than once or twice a year, he goes into seizures. And we kind of can tell just when they're about to happen, which very much relates to this, but we don't completely understand why they're happening, and neither does science really. And there's just sort of theories about that. So there are phenomena that might involve just the brain or the brain and the whole body that explains my dog's seizures. But most of the time, for those sorts of things, then you know, we understand the things my dog's brain does, the things my dog's heart does, his liver does, and so on. And they can kind of be like independent. And if, you know, something were to break down, you could swap in a new part, or you could come up with a new function that attacks. So, you know, break one, you know, if one part loses its function, the rest of them continue to function as their own parts. And so that somehow makes it seems to be a strength. And so this type of complex system acts kind of like, you know, a complicated system. So I could say it's like a complicated system from last time. And I like this graph that that Schaefer puts in there, where he says that, I don't think it has axis in here, but if you apply a stress to the system and you look at some endogenous state variable of the system, so some observable state variable, then as you apply the stress, you do get some deformation. So it doesn't resist, it adapts to change. So he calls this adaptive capacity. And well, I guess I'll ask that question in a second here, but and so the idea here is that the system isn't trying to maintain exactly its function. It kind of gives in a little bit. But because of that, then we usually see smooth changes, and only smooth changes, in the endogenous state variables, in the state variables inside the system. The system sort of responds in a way that makes sense, that, yeah, it might be, we might have kind of nominally expected that this performance to be up here, you know, heart rate or whatever. But as you increase the stress, like temperature or something like that, then you end up getting a smooth change in that. And it kind of has this predictable pattern. So it has a lot of predictability from the outside environment to the inside environment. So there's more predictability in these types of systems. I'll say more predictable. Now, on the flip side of that, I could have something that is not very modular, which means everything's connected to everything else. And most of the parts look pretty much the same. So I couldn't find a heart. I couldn't find a brain. Somehow the functions of the heart and the brain are distributed through the whole thing. So if you break some part of it, you might be breaking multiple functions simultaneously. But on the flip side of that, if you break some small part of it, there might be a bunch of other things that will be able to take over. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be this. So I'll say this is interconnected and heterogeneous, or homogeneous, homogeneous. An example here would be like, I just have a bunch of things that look alike that all influence each other. So there's like a network of influences. You can think of each one of these as like causal links among things that all look very similar to each other. And the links just go everywhere. So we've got to get the idea there. And so there's no obvious modules. And so if you were to knock out something, you have, it's a double-edged sword. If you were to knock out one of these little things, it's very possible that whatever function that little thing was providing, we don't know, it's complex, could be taken up by other things that are connected to it. They could fill in that. But on the flip side of that, once you knock out enough of them, then it might be that a bunch of functions fail and the system behaves totally differently. And so that Schaefer ends up drawing a different looking graph. And we plot our endogenous state variable up here. And that graph is going to have it maintains function for some time. And then after the stress gets sufficiently high, it flips to a totally different function. And so we might view this as absorptive capacity, using a term I was using last time. So it can absorb change, but it's vulnerable to regime shifts. And it has alternative stable states. So I could say it has discrete, not continuous, discrete stable states. Here's one down here. Here's one up here. And real complex systems can be a combination of the two of them. Like I said, my dog, most of the time, acts like a standard multicellular organism. It's got organs, tissues, etc., a hierarchy of modules, but occasionally has seizures. And so you could think that this is Dexter without seizures. This is Dexter with seizures. Stays in this for a short amount of time, and then thankfully after 30 seconds or so, pops back up. And it literally, his brain reboots. Like, it takes him like a half hour to figure out who we are again, where the house is. It's an amazing process. And then it's like he doesn't know what even happened after that. So it's these two states, but most of the time acts like this, but occasionally acts like that. And if we knew every time how to predict when this is going to happen, occasionally when we can tell this is going to happen, I can just go crazy in front of him. I say, "Oh, you want a treat?" and all these sorts of things. And a lot of times right after I do that, he does not have a seizure. And so I don't know if I prevented it. It's, correlation and causation and all that sort of stuff. I mean, but if I can predict that this regime shift is going to happen, there are things at least I can try real quick to see if I can prevent this. But they may not work, but at least I have something that I need to know then that tight window when this is going to happen. And so that's really what a lot of this chapter is about, is how to predict this. And it's really tough because, if you think about coral reefs and things like that, the day-to-day stressors, the shocks to them they face, they're able to suppress. But at some random time in the future, when the temperature of the ocean gets just high enough, then you get a sudden onset of bleaching. And so that's sort of the question, is well, you could withstand all these short-term shocks that seem very large, but then you have this, you suddenly hit this point in this condition, this slow variable, this exogenous variable like temperature. And once you go over that point, the system tips without an exogenous shock, without a storm, without one of these things, into a new state. And that's what we'd say, well, how do we detect what that's going to happen so that we can maybe hopefully capture it before it falls? So any questions about these two distinctions here? I like this little taxonomy that they created here of heterogeneity and interconnectedness or connectivity. I think that's a nice way to sort of separate out the kind of these two qualitatively different phenomena in complex systems. Yeah. There are a ton of natural systems that do this. Yeah, absolutely. But it happens to be in a lot of living systems for whatever reason, and we can philosophize about those reasons. But for a lot of living systems that have been very successful, that they tend to organize themselves like this. And so if we think about the inside of the coral, if we think about the organisms that live, the polyps that live in the corals and those sorts of things, inside the polyp, inside the multicellular organism, you get a structure that's like this. But when we think about ecosystems, Ecosystems, natural selection doesn't act on ecosystems, it acts on individuals. And so ecosystems oftentimes are more like this. And so you've got a biodiversity, maybe that's your stress axis, and you start knocking out, okay, we've got 100 animals, 100 species in the forest, we kill one, I'll get 99. But it's kind of like this, you kill that one, you got 99, forest still acts fine. 98, whatever, forest is fine. And suddenly there's one species you get rid of, or just enough you get rid of, and the forest goes from one biome to another, something like that. It totally changes. And you wonder kind of what happened there. And I think then so tends to be that things that are the sort of the product of natural selection tend to kind of be like this, but things that are just happening, they're brought together and there's no organizing principle like selection that's driving them, but they just sort of, it's opportunistic, really. Like, things like, a forest comes together, that community, it's almost kind of random. There's selection that acts on who gets to stay there, but the components of it are a little bit more random. So I would say like community ecology is more here, physiology is more here for the most part, if that makes sense. Other questions about that? All right, so these are the wicked systems that we kind of need to worry about, that this sort of chapter is about. All right, and so they talked here about, in this chapter, I want to bring this terms up, global versus local resilience. Did anyone pick up on which one of these is which, or what those terms mean? Or have a guess? Yeah. Local changes. So yeah, so you're saying that this one is what you call local resilience, because like if there's a small change, it pretty much doesn't move at all. Right. So this one's global, because even though local changes, because even though local changes create a change, there's no massive changes that you're going to get. So if you get a massive change, it might actually counterintuitively be that in this system, if you had a large change in the stressor, you might actually get more of a change out of this system than this system. Because it might be that a large change in this system produces a small change in this line, but a large change in this system shifts you to a regime that is so different that the step difference between the regime is really big. So if you know that you're just going to have small fluctuations in some stressor, then this system tends to work out a little bit, maybe a little bit better, because I'm sorry, if you know you're going to have large changes, then this system might work out a little bit better, because it's not going to stray too far. But in this system, if you have large changes, you can get total jumps. But if you know that you're just going to have very, very small changes, then this system works out pretty well, because it can just sit on this line and you won't even notice the changes exist. So yeah, that's the way I interpret local and global as well, is that I would say this here is locally resistant or locally resilient. And this one here is globally resilient, but not locally. And there is a trade-off between the two. So the more a system has global resilience, it probably gives up on the local changes. The more a system has local resilience, it probably becomes very brittle to global changes. And if you think about materials and things like that, rubbers versus thin plastics or whatever, things that can shatter are typically things that if you bend a little bit, they don't really move much. Things that can bend a lot are those that give a lot of it, so how much give they have is sort of along this same type of axis here. Yeah. Is that a question? Yeah. That's an interesting comment. So the comment there is local resilient worse because as the stressor changes, the observable output does not. And I think in a lot of systems, that is the case. And that's what makes these systems, like I said, so particularly wicked, is that, you know, there might be some stressor that we don't even realize has a causal connection. We don't even realize that temperature is an exogenous variable driving the system, because as you increase temperature, the system doesn't seem to care until it does. And at that instant, you realize, oh, shoot, it turns out that temperature was playing a major role, but the system kept reconfiguring itself until it couldn't. At this instant, when it couldn't reconfigure itself, it became a new system. Yeah. Any other questions about that, global and local resilience? All right, so let's see the graphs that make sense of this. So we're trying to, and our goal is to understand how to predict this stuff. And so we have to figure out, you know, and so we started learning about these ball-in-a-basin models, and that starts giving us a conceptual handle or hold on what might be going on here and how to deal with that. So I just want to kind of go back to these ball-in-basin things. So, you know, we mentioned before that if you have like a fish population, I guess I'll just maybe draw it in the middle here. So if I have a fish population, the very basic step into figuring out what my variables are is to come up with a causal loop diagram to figure out what's encouraging what. So I've got birth rate, death rate, and you say, well, what changes the death rate? Well, what, you know, that's carrying capacity, which I'll call K. And then those, so with more births, you get more fish. With more fish, you get more births. That's a reinforcing loop. With more fish, because you're close to carrying capacity or get close to carrying capacity, you get more deaths. If you raise the carrying capacity, you'll get less deaths. With more deaths, you get less fish. That's a balancing loop. We look at that. And then we also have our harvest rate if we're harvesting this thing. And that's another exogenous variable. And so if we look at that, we say, aha, that's S-shaped growth, or limit, and or it's growth limits to growth. And so we know that the behavior over time is going to have two regions, a transient region of growth, but then a final but then a steady state of this population here. So if I call my fish population, I'll just call it P. So I can call this P as for our fish population. Then I've got some equilibrium fish population. So this is a stable state. And I will call that P star. And so then the question is, what determines P star? Certainly it must depend upon harvest rate. So harvest rate becomes our exogenous variable that we're changing. And our question is, does P star change and how does it change? And does it change smoothly, like one of those modular systems, or does it change abruptly, like one of those kind of wicked systems that is sort of homogeneous and those sorts of things? And so in order for us to get a handle on that, so this is a good kind of qualitative understanding, to get to this more quantitative question of what actually happens. I'm going to say more quantitative, it's still very qualitative, but we're at least getting things we're imagining it has different values. Then we say, well, what determines an equilibrium? Well, an equilibrium is where things come into balance. So the equilibrium fish population, P star, happens when the harvest rate, which I'll call HR, is equal to the net regeneration rate. which I'll call NRR just for short, where this is just the birth rate, births minus deaths. And I did this last time, so I'm just kind of doing it kind of quickly here. So if I were to, maybe I'll just copy this onto a new page for me, just to give me a little more room. So that'll come back here in just a second. So now if I know my harvest rate, it's a set constant because it's an exogenous variable. My net regeneration rate is it's effectively an endogenous thing. It depends on births and deaths. And so I can plot that based on the fish population. So if I plot this thing up here, let's say I'll do this guy here. This is my fish population P. And this here is going to be both of these. So my harvest rate will be at some level, and my net regeneration rate, I'll just do K for carrying capacity. Net regeneration looks something like this. So it's food limited at high populations, and it's sort of unlimited. So they just grow and grow at low populations, and they kind of round off in between. And so this is my net regeneration rate right there. And then I draw my harvest rate in at some point that I'm testing. And if I look at that, then I can ask, where will this system balance? And I know for sure that it'll balance in two places. The trivial place it'll balance is when there's no fish there, and it doesn't even allow my harvest rate to do anything. So the harvest rate is kind of a moot point. It's sort of forced to zero, this trivial case there. I also know that it comes into balance at this point where the harvest rate is equal to the net regeneration rate. So you're pulling out exactly the same amount of fish you get pulled out, get regenerated by the fish population in the background. It's like interest in a bank. There's also this funny little point over here that I look at and I say, well, technically the fish population could come into balance there. But I have to think about, well, what would happen at each one of these points? Well, I know that if my harvest rate is greater than the net regeneration, in that case, the population declines. But I know that if the net regeneration is greater than the harvest rate, then in that case, the population rises. So I can now think about this whole line here and figure out what goes, whether each one of these points is truly stable or not. Because I know that underneath here, for this region down here, anything underneath here, that's when the harvest rate is greater than this net regeneration rate. In fact, maybe it's just easier. I'll just take this and I'll just put it under here. So here, that's when the harvest rate is greater than the net regeneration rate. Move this out of the way for a second. And up here, this is where the net regeneration rate is greater than the harvest rate. So what that means is that all movement above that line, above the harvest rate, will have the population moving to the right. All movement below that harvest rate will have the population moving to the left. And so now I can say, well, okay, so down here, the population is moving to the left. Or I could put it down here, it's moving to the left until it hits this point. And then over on the left side of this diagram here, I know that the population is also moving to the left from this point. So I could draw in little left arrows there. And I know that above that line, the population is moving to the right. So it's moving to the right for this whole region up here. It's getting bigger above that line, which down here would move it this way. So I've got left motion toward the red dot, right motion toward the solid dot, and then left motion toward the solid dot from the other side. And that's what tells me that this is so that extinction is stable. And it tells me that this point up here, this is a sustainable, stable equilibrium. And that other balance point that was in the middle, that's just a threshold of population between regimes. All right, so are there any questions about this diagram, where it comes from? It's a little bit of math, but without the numbers, but it's just this idea of where things come into balance. This is the Apple Pencil sitting upright on its tip. This is it's flipped over on one side. This is it's flipped over on the other side. Yeah. Sounds good. That's fine. This is meant to be hard. So yeah. Any particular, where do we want to start? So population in a fishery, if the fish can reproduce faster than you can fish, then the population will grow. And so this is how fast the fish reproduce just based on how many fish. When there's no fish, they don't reproduce. When there's this amount of fish, they reproduce pretty fast. When there's this amount of fish, they start having a hard time finding food, so they start reproducing a little slower. When there's this amount of fish, there's just not enough food, and they really cut down on their reproduction. So there's slow reproduction here because it's a low population, slow reproduction here because it's just not enough food, fast reproduction here because it's kind of the sweet spot. So if you can harvest under this rate, then this, for all of these populations, you'll get growing fish population because you are harvesting like the fish. As long as the fish started up here, then these fish will continue to reproduce faster than you're pulling them out. And that causes the population to grow. So what ends up happening though is the population grows so much that they start fighting for their own food. The fish can't reproduce that quickly, and they start slowing down, and they will slow down to exactly the harvest rate. And that is how you get your sustainable equilibrium. Yeah. And so if you can see here, if you buy all that, if I take this harvest rate, if I harvest a little bit higher, then the amount of fish left in the fishery will decline. So this intersection will keep moving to the left. And that makes sense. You fish more, you're going to have less fish kind of left in the fishery. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And I'm about to do exactly that. So yeah, that point that you up there that you're talking about, that's what's referred to, and I'll say this in a second, is the maximum sustainable yield. That is the most you can fish in a fishery. And if you fish more than that, you're basically just going to empty the fishery. Any other questions? I want to make sure we're clear on this. This is the most mathy thing that we're going to do. I just do this because if I don't do this, I start drawing these balls on basins. It doesn't make, where did the ball come from? Where did the basin come from? I'm just trying to motivate that there is math that if, in theory, if you know some of the stuff that, like in that third paper, it talks about building these potential graphs or whatever, you can translate this into those ball and basin models. But once we buy that ball and basin models aren't fiction, that they come from math, the rest of the class, we use ball and basin models. And I think it's a lot easier to think about balls rolling around basins. But we need to be confident that the ball and basin models actually mean anything. And that's the only reason I'm getting to this little bit of quantitative stuff. Yeah. if you shock the system, so if you're fish, if something happens, there's like a major storm event or whatever, and there's a lot of mortality, and the fish were sitting here, and it shocks them, so they go over that threshold, so now they're below this point, they'll go extinct. If you keep the same harvest rate. So if there is a shock to the system, then we know that, well, maybe, because there was this giant storm and we know there's a lot of fish mortality, let's hold off on harvesting for 6 months, because we need to make sure that when we start harvesting, the fish are in this regime. Because if the fish population's in this regime and we harvest at this rate, we're just going to drive them extinct. Any other questions? Excellent questions. And I'm glad when I really like that you said, I'm not getting any of this. And everybody else said, I'm not getting any of this. I'm almost 42 years old. This is like not my first rodeo. So when I was in your seat, this was just as opaque to me as it is to you. So trust me that like I was there. So if you got those questions, stop me. And that's why I give these anecdotes, and I don't get as much done as I should, because I want you to phrase these questions. Okay. All right, great. So this is confusing. We need something that is more conceptually understandable. Yeah. Yeah. Right, I'm going to draw it right now. This is the bottom of one valley. This is the bottom of the other valley. This is the hill that separates them. Great, great. Yeah, so that's, this is hard. So what we do is we create something that makes it easier to understand and think about. And that's the so-called ball-in-basin models. I think in one of the papers, I thought I wrote it down. Yeah, it's also called this. So this is the ball-in-basin model. Ball-in-a-basin is one way to view it. This is also called a potential model. And so the idea here is we now can say, well, you know what? Can I create a landscape where if I placed a ball on the landscape, it would roll to the left or right at speeds that match what the fish would do if I shocked the system and say, move the fish here. Like if I killed a bunch of fish and then saw how long did it take them to come back here, can I build a hill so that if I put a ball out here on the hill, how long would it take it to roll down the hill and come back to the valley? That's what I want to try to build, is a hill that produces the same speed stuff here. And so that's what I'll do down here. So I'll say, well, okay, that hill, maybe use a different color. Maybe I'll do green. It's gonna be sort of infinitely high over here, because you can't ever have less than 0 fish. And it's going to have a valley down here. But we know that at that threshold position, it's going to have to be like the top of a hill. So somewhere around, I didn't give myself a lot of room, but there's this like thin little valley that has a peak up there. And then I know at this other position, that's the bottom of another valley. So I'll kind of do this. And if I draw it just right, I'll hit the bottom right there. And I know it can't ever have more than K fish. So then the valley kind of comes back up. And then it's infinitely high again. And so now, if I were to draw a ball, make it an orange ball. If I were to draw a ball in here, I can picture that ball when it's anywhere on this side of this hill, it's going to roll and eventually land down here. At the same spot as that blue one. Here. So if I put a ball over here, It's going to roll down here and eventually hit that spot. If I, though, were to put the ball on the other side of the valley, like over here, then it would plummet into extinction here. So now we can see that the threshold corresponds to the top of a hill, that one sustainable state corresponds to this valley, and the other sustainable state corresponds to this valley. And so the ball and basin model is a so-called potential field. It's like a hill that if you roll a ball along it, the speed of the ball corresponds to the speed of the fish population as it races back towards either its stable state here or its stable state there. So questions on this transformation, where we get the ball and basin model? Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh yeah. So this is fish pop, the same as above. And whereas this axis was like fish, in units of fish per year, but I was plotting two things at once. This one is a little harder. It's like a height. But it's a virtual height. It's not like a real height. So I'm creating a fiction where instead of having fish reproducing like fish do, I'm having balls roll around on landscapes. And you can think of this as the landscape height that makes the ball roll around the same way the fish move around. Does that make sense? The physicists would actually call this potential. So this is like gravitational potential. And so this is like a potential well. That's what we call it in physics. And this is a so-called double well potential because there's two of them and they can go from one to the other. All right, any other questions about that? So I hope you see, and this is coming back to that question earlier about what happens when you raise the harvest rate up and up. The shape of this hill is determined by where the harvest rate is. If you move the harvest rate up, you draw a different hill. If you move the harvest rate down, you draw a different hill. The steepnesses of the valleys change, the positions of the valleys, even the number of the valleys change based on where this is drawn. So I can kind of do a quick sketch of a couple of these regimes. And I guess, by the way, I don't think I'll end up, I'm not going to draw this, but if you look at the instructor's notes, I'll put this up. So, but I've included this example in my instructor's notes where I've included a complicated predator-prey causal loop diagram. And you don't have to read all those details, but the important thing is there's deer, actually deer in Arizona deer near the Grand Canyon, and predators. Call them wolves or something like that. And so you can plot the deer population on one axis and the predator population on another axis and kind of forget about time. So every point here is the time. And so at the beginning, you start out with this high number of predators, intermediate number of deer, your predator population falls, your deer population starts to rise, your deer population falls as your predator population rises, and so on. And so this is sort of a view here of predator and prey together on one plot. This is what we call a parametric plot. If I were to plot the behavior over time, I would have deer oscillating at in one way and predators oscillating in a different way. And the two would sort of look similar to each other, but offset a little bit. Because when there's a lot of deer, there's usually low predators, but they're going to start growing fast. And once there's a lot of predators, there's usually low deer. So this is one way to visualize the system. But we can build a potential field or a hill function for this as well. And it would look like this, where you've got your predators on this axis, your deer on this axis, the height or the potential on this axis. And what you see here is like a funnel that the ball is spiraling down into. And so this is in your book. in the resilience book, he has a couple of two-dimensional ball-in-basin diagrams. And that's where this comes from. We're only going to think about the one-dimensional one because it's just easier to deal with, for the purpose of the class. But when you go and start doing this stuff, you usually are looking at more than one endogenous variable at a time. And so it's really useful to think in multiple dimensions here, where it really is a landscape that you can rotate on. And you get these spiraling patterns that happen in the math also would happen, going down the drain. So questions about that? Does that make sense? This guy here? All right, so that one there again, if you look at the instructor's notes linked from this lecture on Canvas, I got that there in case you want that, but I'm not going to redraw it. What I do want to draw, though, is just a couple of examples so that we can get to this notion of tipping points from this, is that if I were to draw the same net regeneration function 4 times, so here's my net regeneration function, and I'm just going to copy that thing and paste it a couple of times. Now I'll just take that group and copy and paste those. And now I can think about 4 different harvest rates. So I can think about a harvest rate that is no harvesting. I can think about a harvest rate that's like we've already seen, sort of in between. I can think of the maximum sustainable yield, and then I can think about overfishing. So this is overfishing. This is the max sustainable yield, or MSY, as you might hear in other classes. This is kind of some harvesting. And this is no harvest. And I don't need to go through and draw all of the arrows for what's doing what, but I can say if I were to, then in the no harvest, I would get a stable equilibria at the carrying capacity. And this is your standard logistic growth curve from like SOS 101. And the extinction equilibrium would end up getting the threshold. And so extinction would now become unstable. So when you don't harvest, fish just go to their carrying capacity. There's no chance of extinction. We've already seen this one where we've got the extinction equilibrium, we've got the threshold, and we've got this one. Over here, we've got the extinction equilibrium. And up top here, I'm going to actually draw it as a threshold, so an open circle, but it's where the two sort of come together. It's almost like a fictitious point. And then over here, there's only extinction at the overfishing. And so for each one of those, I could draw or could sketch out a hill function. And so for this one, the hill function might, I'll use green again. The hill function might look, flat on one side, and then it'll be flat at the carrying capacity, and then it'll just be kind of a hill that goes down to here. This one here for some harvest, it's exactly the one we just drew. So it's flat kind of all the way down. It comes up, it peaks at the threshold, and then it comes back down, and then it comes back up again. For this one, this max sustainable yield one, it has the extinction equilibrium, and right around the point of what I'm calling the threshold there, there's maybe a little tiny bump, but hardly noticeable, and then it basically goes up. And then finally for overfishing, it's just basically looks like the inverse of what we started with. And so I hope you can see here that we've got our extinction equilibrium here. down here, and down here. We've got our sustainable equilibrium here. And then right when you're at the max sustainable yield, this is actually probably right before the max sustainable yield, where you're just harvesting almost to the max amount you can harvest. It's like this valley is still there, but it's just a little bump. It just, you know, so I'm just going to draw a little circle there. And then the valley disappears completely. So it's like as I'm dragging the harvest rate up, what I'm doing is I'm kind of pulling this edge down, causing this thing to pop up, this threshold to pop up, and then kind of moving that threshold around. So this threshold will end up moving this way as this harvest rate moves up. And as the threshold moves this way, this edge kind of moves up as well. So by the time you get to this harvest rate, this threshold and this edge have basically met each other and nullified each other out. And so you get these different ball-in-basin functions for different harvest rates. And you can stack all those things together to summarize what happens as you change your harvest rate. And so I want to emphasize that the harvest rate is an exogenous variable or a slow variable. So harvest rate is exogenous or slow. And the fish population here is endogenous or fast, are terms that we use for that. So questions about this visualization? We just took what we just did and spread it out over different harvest rates. And that right there allows me to introduce the bifurcation diagram, which takes all of this and combines it into one beautiful, concise diagram. It looks like a phase transition diagram from chemistry. So let's see. I hate to, well, I'm gonna do this. Well, I'll do it down here. I'll just cram it. So bifurcation diagram. That bifurcation diagram is going to have the exogenous variable or the slow variable on the x-axis. So this is our exogenous variable. Exogenous. So this is our harvest rate. And on the y-axis, it's going to be the stable states of the endogenous variable. So these are the stable states, all of them, of the endogenous variable. And so in that case, it'd be fish population. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's too bad it isn't red, but that'll be fine. If I don't harvest, then I know that I only have one stable state, and that's at carrying capacity. So if I don't harvest, it's the extinction equilibrium I could draw in as like a little red circle, I suppose. But the only stable equilibrium is up here at carrying capacity, K. As I harvest, then the stable equilibrium starts ramping down like this. Where it gets to a point here. And as the stable equilibrium starts moving down, then this threshold, remember, it pops up and it separates these two equilibrium, because you always need a hill in between two valleys. And that is going to end up being something that looks like a mirror of it. And I'm going to draw it with a dashed line. and maybe I'll make these thicker just to drive home this point here, that this curve up here, and then I've got it dashed. And then down here, I've got my extinction equilibrium this whole way through here. And so you can see for all harvest rates, extinction is a stable equilibrium, except for when you don't harvest at all. That's the one example where it's not. For harvest rates up to the maximum sustainable yield, this is up to this maximum sustainable yield harvest rate. So this is, I'll say, the MSY harvest rate. Then I have a stable equilibrium up here, but it gets smaller and smaller. This a dashed line, so a solid equals stable, and dashed equals unstable or threshold. And so this summarizes here that for any harvest rates under this, I've got two regimes. And if my initial condition is a fish population that's high enough, it will automatically go up to this one. If it's lower than this threshold, it will automatically go down to this. But if I swing my harvest rate too high, this regime goes away. And I think I'll talk about this next time so we can finish up this, but this right here is the so-called tipping point, and I'll define that next time. But this allows us to picture things like if your fish population started here, it'll go up, but then if you increase to overfish, your fish population will go down. If you then decrease your harvest rate, it'll go down, but it won't go back up unless you decrease it far enough to cross that threshold again, and that's the utility of that. All right, so we'll cover that next time. I think I've assigned a reading for Tuesday. If I decide over the weekend to move it to Thursday, I'll let you know, but right now it's still Tuesday. And here's your attendance slide. So question for today is the harvest rate an endogenous or exogenous variable in the fish system? The harvest rate, endogenous or exogenous? And don't forget your muddiest points as well. And that's all I've got for you. Thanks for your time. You too.